Okay, great. How do I make this disappear? Like that? So if I show the full screen with my slide, then all you can see is this control panel, right?
We don't see the control panel.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And there's a little orange button at the top that'll
The arrow.
make it go away for you.
Perfect. Excellent. All right. So welcome to this training session. We call it the Geoscience Paper of the Future. It's a training session that will tell you best practices and kind of forward-looking ways to look at publishing scientific papers. This is part of the OntoSoft project. It's part of the EarthCube initiative. And you can see there pictures of a lot of pioneers in writing this geoscience paper of the future. We'll tell you more about this in a minute. The slides that we're going to use are available. We'll make them public to you. You can see the license at the bottom, so you can disseminate them as a whole. Very soon, we are going to make them public in the project website. So we'll announce that to all of you as well when they're widely available. And the reason to hold off is that we're kind of trying to improve them as we go through more training sessions. So I think after this meeting, they seem pretty stable. So probably after this meeting, they'll be pretty final and ready for general release. But we'll email you the slides shortly after the webinar. So today, the webinar, the training is going to be given by two people, myself. My name is Yolanda Gil. I am a computer scientist. I'm at the Information Sciences Institute and the Computer Science Department at the University of Southern California. And I don't know anything much about geosciences and geosciences research, but I do collaborate with a lot of geoscientists. I started working with earthquake and seismic hazard analysis simulations. I also work with water quality, hydrologists, and ecologists, and more recently with limnologists and paleoclimatologists. So I kind of get infused a lot of kind of meta-knowledge about the challenges of doing geosciences research, and so my personal research is on building intelligence systems that assist scientists in their research. So the other instructor is Mimi Tseng, and I'll let Mimi introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Mimi. I'm at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab in the Data Management Center. My background is in marine biology, and I've been in oceanography somewhere for the last, I don't know, 12 or 13. At the moment, as in the Data Management Center, I do mostly work with metadata, and I'll be talking later about the data sharing part of this presentation. I think that's pretty much it for me.
Thank you, Mimi. And Mimi will be giving part of the training, but also she's one of those pioneer geoscience papers of the future authors. So I think what she has to say will be a lot more practical than anything I would say. Okay, so this training is brought to you as part of an overarching umbrella of projects called EarthCube. It's an initiative that NSF started 3 or 4 years ago, and the goal of EarthCube is to really transform the practices of science in the geosciences community, give researchers new capabilities, make them more productive, and really provide a knowledge management framework for the geosciences. There's a nice report if you're interested on the www.earthcube.org website that really gives you an overview of how the NSF is viewing this initiative and how is it structuring it so that it is very much science-driven, community-driven, and they're putting a lot of thought on how to involve the community in the development of cyber infrastructure. As part of this EarthCube initiative, I'm the PI of one of the projects. The project is called OntoSoft, and the goal is to provide software stewardship for the geosciences. So this training and this webinar is part of the efforts in our project to disseminate the best practices and provide these materials to geoscientists to learn to improve their practices. Erin Robinson, who is on the call and arranged this training webinar. Erin Robinson is one of the co-PIs. She's also the director at ESIP. And other co-PIs are Chris Duffy, who's a hydrologist at Penn State, Scott Peckham, who's a hydrologist also at the University of Colorado Boulder, and Chris Madman, who is a chief architect of one of the divisions at JPL at NASA, and he's also one of the directors at the Apache Software Foundation. So we all look at software from different perspectives, but we notice that in geosciences, some software is shared through some means. We'll talk about that today, but in many cases it is not. And so OntoSoft is meant to improve how software is shared in geosciences. And part of our project is to build a community that will share and reuse and be aware of the software that is out there that might be useful to each of them to do research. Also, tools to publish and describe software, give advice to scientists interactively about how to reuse software and how to publish their own software, and then the learning and training aspects that I'm mentioning. So part of the OntoSoft project is an early career advisory board. We've been working with them to understand how to best get best practices in software sharing to geoscientists, and one of the products of those discussions has been this initiative of writing geoscience papers of the future. And I just wanted to show you that a lot of the Geosoft project PIs are actually in this slide, but also a lot of those advisory board members became authors of these papers, and they actually are part of these training webinars like Mimi is today. So that is very good because it helps us convey their motivation for writing these papers and why you all who are in the webinar today should too. The way that we do this training is we do 2 sessions. It's an hour and a half each session, and there's a half-an-hour intermission break in the middle. The first session starts with a motivation and an overview of why you would want to learn these best practices, why do you want to write papers differently. Once we cover that, you probably have a lot of motivation to be here today, but we want to give you the broader picture and maybe more munition to approach your friends to take this training in future webinars or face-to-face meetings. Then we talk about making data accessible. How do you make sure that the data that you're mentioning and using or generating in a paper is accessible to others? Then we'll talk about how to do the same thing with software, how to publish software. The second part of the training is focused on documenting software. We think that maybe documenting data with metadata is something that everybody has heard more about, but not so much about how to document software, so we cover that. And then we talk about documenting the provenance of the results of the paper and the methods, the kind of workflow, the general methods that were followed. And we wrap up with a summary that kind of walks you through if you were writing a geoscience paper. Somebody just called in. Welcome, but there's a lot of noise coming from your line. Maybe you can mute yourself. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so we wrap up with an author checklist that kind of summarizes all the things that we've talked about, and Mimi will also talk about her particular experience with her paper and how she approached it and what she did. One big aspect of what we're doing is not just training you to do something, but we arranged for a special issue of the Earth and Space Science Journal that is accepting geoscience papers of the future. So as you finish the training today, you can look around at the papers that you are writing or papers that you wrote in the past that you wish you had written better, and maybe you can consider preparing a submission for this special issue. It's open until January, so the AGU insisted that we left the submissions open for quite a bit of time because they are very interested in pushing their publications in this general direction. So we'll talk more about this as well. But this is the overview of the training topics. Another thing I wanted to mention is what the training covers and what it won't cover. So it will focus on best practices. As we are aware of them, many of the best practices are still under discussion and being developed by different organizations in the community. You can see a lot of them mentioned at the bottom. ESIP is one of them. The Research Data Alliance is another one. So they have working groups that are working on data citation, dynamic data citation, software citation, the archival of software as it relates to the publication of papers. All of these topics are very much active in the community, but what we've done is collect best practices from all of them. That's what we teach here. And we also are mindful of the effort that they take. So sometimes you can spend, quite a bit of time, several days, documenting something that you've done in a paper, but there are simpler ways to get things done, maybe in minutes, that actually have benefit. And so we are mindful of that level of effort, and we teach you both sides, what you can do in the short term, with a relatively very small amount of effort, and what you can do in the longer term if you want to improve your general practices. We also teach major concepts, so it's independent of the platform or the programming language you're using or your research area or the journal you'll be publishing in. So they're pretty general and lifted from the specifics that you use. We may mention specific context, so what happens if you use R, or what tools may be available out there, but the training is pretty generic. So we're not going to walk you through how to do X, Y, Z in a particular tool. And then we really emphasize how would you implement these best practices with the simplest approach. So we start by teaching you the best practices, and then what can you do if you want to take a few minutes to do better than you're doing right now. So that's what we'll teach you. What we will not teach you is, if you're in hydrology, what are the metadata standards that you should adopt, or if you're doing climate research, what those are. We don't cover that. We don't cover discipline-specific topics. Also, we won't teach you to improve your software development skills. We may mention something that may be useful, but we're not going to teach you to do version control or anything like that. And we're not going to show you the details of using code sharing sites like GitHub or anything like that. Those are things that we don't cover specifically, okay? So let me start with the first part of the training about this background and general motivation for writing papers differently and what you learn in the process of writing papers differently. So traditional scientific articles, when you publish them, there's text and there's maybe data in tables or figures, and if you use software, then you might mention it, but not necessarily, right? And you may, these days, partially publish the data. So many people add these days supplementary materials or maybe pointers to data repositories now that they're available. Typically, the software is not published. It may be loosely recorded or described at a very high level. And so there's not a lot of details about how the results of the paper were obtained other than the narrative, the natural language narrative. But the context of science is really changing in a lot of ways. So the scientists that do research themselves, we are changing. So we're getting used to having data openly available. We're getting used to open source software. So if software is proprietary, we may stay away from using it. We're more used to open source software. We're getting used to open access and open publications. So we're more used to having licenses and ways to access the contributions of science research more openly. So scientists were beginning to be more used to the idea that science belongs to all of us, humanity, and so we should have access to all the results of scientific research. Another thing that's very interesting is that you would think that data or papers are really the focus of science. You hear so much about data these days. But this is the results of a survey that Nature did some years ago, and you can see that the top things that scientists care about in terms of getting credit for the contributions to science, way up there is software. So setting up a database or developing software is very high up there, together with their publications and their grants and so on, and their students. What you see in the front of the slide is an excerpt of the longer list that you see on the right, and you can see that their data is actually very, very low in the list, much, much lower in the list than the software. So this is very interesting because it means that it's not just about the data, but there's a lot of context about how the data is generated that scientists really care about. Publishers are changing, so Science and Nature have been having editorials and special issues on really making sure that when you publish a scientific article that it can be replicated, is reproducible, you're specifying all the details, and in some sense that all the computational and maybe physical apparatus that you use to generate your new results are well documented. And some journals, many journals now, more and more every day, I see announcements of this sort every day, have requirements for authors in terms of making the software available. The public is also changing, so people are taking an interest in science. You hear a lot about projects in citizen science that you can see on the left. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these. So people really care to see what's happening with science. People care that scientists are serious and rigorous about the kinds of things that they tell the public about what's happening, and what are better foods to eat, what's happening with climate change, and so on and so forth. And then at the bottom is a fascinating paper that I found a couple of years ago, written by accountants that know nothing about genomics, and they actually have a family history of a particular disease, and so they got interested in a certain mutation, gene mutation, and they met online, and they decided to figure out what was up with this gene mutation, and they contacted researchers, and the researchers said, oh yeah, we're not going to get to that particular mutation for a long time. We have higher priority with other things. And so they just went at it. They just found the most up-to-date software tools and analytics in genomics. They set them up on their desktops. They run a lot of analysis as best they could, and they contacted one genomics expert at Oxford, and he actually made sure that they had enough data. Turns out they didn't, so they went back online, asked everybody in the forums if they would give them data about their own genome. People did, and so they did get significantly significant results, and so they published this paper in one of the premier journals in science. So it tells you that people are interested in using all sorts of things in science, not just the data, but the software, and actually contributing as they can. Funders are changing. So, for example, in the US, but also in the UK, there's a lot of interest in making anything that comes out of public funds and federal funds, in the case of the US, available to the general public, in particular results of research. And so all the agencies have been mandated by the Office of the President to try to set up processes and procedures in place to have any projects that are funded by the government release all the products of the research. So the NSF in particular has a recently released report talking about their plans to put some measures in place, and they have several working groups working in this general area trying to develop new policies to accomplish this mandate. So the scientists are changing, the public is changing, publishers are changing, funders are changing. So we see these trends in transforming scientific articles, and I think the training session today is part of that trend on making the published articles go beyond being a PDF file with a narrative and a few figures. So you see data now included in a lot of articles. That's really good news. There's actually data papers that you see in some journals, so you can describe a particular data set that may be generally of interest. There's a lot of investment on data repositories, and a lot of scientists publish their data there, so this is really changing. There's a lot of data that still is not published. It's generally called dark data, following this paper that you see in the slide. So a lot of people are wondering what would it take to get all the data that is generated in science to be published and available to everybody. So you start to see that in this trend, people start to wonder about the software. You cannot accurately describe computational results unless you make the software available and all the details about how you work with the software. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of journals now have requirements of what you need to say about software. There's actually also software papers, just like we saw data papers. So some journal articles will be just describing a piece of software, and so those are very useful. We also see, just like we saw data repositories, we see software repositories. In geoscience, it's not just general software repositories like GitHub or Apache, but also specific or specialized repositories for models or special kind of software. And oftentimes software is also not shared, just like we said with data. So, and there's a lot of reasons given for it. So, you know, my code's not ready, it's really bad, and lots of different reasons why. You know, if I share my software, what do I get out of it? I want credit for my work, and the software gives me some advantage. So there's a lot of reasons. Some of them, they make good points, but for every one of these reasons, there's a reason to overcome this and share your software. So there's actually a paper called "Your Software is Good Enough" that we recommend reading. So it actually goes through a lot of these objections and addresses them. We'll talk about many of these today. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that oftentimes we talk about sharing software and you start to imagine, a big hydrology model or a big piece of software that you've developed back when you did your thesis. And sometimes, of course those are important, but sometimes there's a lot of ancillary or less glorified software that is just as important to share. So what I'm showing you in this picture is an analysis of multi-step workflows in different domains in science. You can see from genomics to chemistry, astrophysics, all kinds of domains, from different tools and systems that capture these workflows. And what you can see is that when you look at all the different steps in the workflow, about 60% or more of the steps are actually data preparation steps. So it's just reformatting the data or reconverting it or integrating various pieces and so on. There's actually a call from NASA some years ago saying that scientists and engineers spend more than 60% of their time just preparing data in order to start to do science. And if you go to industry, the people will tell you that their experience is even higher than 60%, and a lot of scientists as well. So when you think of software to share, and you think of a paper, it's not just the main showcase piece of software or model, but also all this other software that you use in the process of preparing the data or generating a figure and so on and so forth. So we talk about the concept of dark software, just like we talked about dark data. There's a lot of this kind of software that's never shared, and we really want to change that. So hopefully today you walk away wanting to share your software. The common situation is, your advisor tells a student, or your boss at some government organization tells you this needs to get done, and you can reuse software that the previous person did, but there's never instructions or comments or no idea of where things are. And so it's actually a lot of work to revive that software, and maybe if we all took better care of documenting and publishing our software, it would be better or easier to use. And we're not talking about major undertakings, we're talking about just being aware of certain best practices that can help the next person around. Reproducibility is also a major issue. So when you talk about software, when you talk about making a paper so that others can understand how you got the results, ideally you would want them to be able to reproduce them if they choose. And sometimes the reproducibility takes so much work that people stop doing it. So you see a pie chart here. It's from Bayer Pharmaceuticals. They try to replicate results of some, these are studies in the biomedical research world, but actually they could not replicate most of those results and they had to abandon the studies. So, and Bayer has money to invest in these replications. Usually in academia, when we try to replicate somebody else's work, it takes effort and we just don't have the resources to do it. There's a lot of papers that are retracted. In 2010, there was actually papers from a Nobel Prize winner that were retracted. So it has a lot of problems. I think reproducibility is something that many people are concerned about with respect to science. So if we want science to be respected, we need to be aware and worry about this. Okay? So you see a trend now to worry about reproducible publications. So we really want to emphasize this. So you should publish your data. You should publish your software. We've been talking about the importance of that. But when you want to make a publication reproducible, you really have to publish how you stitch the software together into a workflow, and actually what were the parameters or the settings that you use to generate certain results. So reproducible publications have become more and more important. There's a lot of tools to do reproducible publications. They're also called executable papers. These two special issues of the journals will give you pointers to some of these tools. I like to talk about the pioneering work that was done in geosciences. You all should be very proud of this. So John Claerbout is a geophysicist at Stanford. He's emeritus now, but he mandated in his group in the 80s that everybody should document every result before they publish a paper, and he created a framework and some guidelines for his students and his group to do this, and that work continues today with the Madagascar system. There's a general package called Sweave where you can actually use LaTeX, and every figure that you include can be linked to our code. And so you can actually see the code and the data that was used to generate every figure included in the paper. And of course, more recently, the IPython notebook that helps document, create a narrative around the code and the results from the code. That is very helpful to share the context of some result that you obtained. So reproducible publications and executable papers is something that people will talk about and mention. And for today, something that we wanted to convince you of is that, is this sufficient? And we think this is not sufficient. There's additional things that we should worry about. So in addition to making your paper reproducible, you would want to get credit for the software that you wrote, for the data sets that you prepared, and so on. And so the best mechanism that exists today, and there's many people researching additional mechanisms, but today the best mechanism is through citations in the papers. So we'll teach you today how to get credit for your papers through citations. Another thing that we want to show is that there's actually been studies that if you actually put your data and publish your data with your paper, that increases the citations that your paper gets. So it actually helps you get more credit the more open that you are with your science. And there's actually a very well-known mathematician who made his data and his code available as common practice in his group, and his group is one of the most cited, he in particular is one of the most cited mathematicians. So there's evidence for that. There's also a very important thing, which is for you to attach licenses to your work, and scientific research products are a result of your work. So you should be very mindful about what you want other people to be able to do with your work, and be permissive and give them permission to do things with your data if you wish to do that. And finally, if you document and make your data citable, and you make it available in public repository, and you make it available, but it's not in a public repository. If you do all of this available on your personal website, then not many people are going to find your data. So we really think that we need to encourage everyone to share their data in a repository. Because it will be better organized and people will know to go there to look for data of a certain kind. So given all of this context, the geoscience paper of the future and what we'll tell you about today is, of course you want to write a modern paper that includes your data, supplementary materials, and so on, but you also want to make your paper a reproducible publication, so publish your software, also document how the software was stitched together and set up, so make the publication reproducible. But we also are going to teach you how to make your science more open through sharing in shared repositories, community repositories, very easy to do if you only want to spend a few minutes, to use open licenses, to have metadata attached to the products of your work, and also to follow digital scholarship practices. So that means making your URLs persistent. We'll talk about what that means, and also set up citations so that you can get credit for your research as you describe it in the paper. Okay, so what the training that we'll cover today will address all of these different topics, and at the end, as I mentioned, we'll give you a summary of how to hit these major areas that we mentioned here. Okay, so what is a geoscience paper of the future? Your data should be available in a public repository. It should include documentation, that means metadata, a license that says how can others reuse it, what constraints you want to place on them, and then it should be citable through a persistent identifier. The software, similarly, and we want to emphasize that it's not just modeling software, but all the other software that you write, and then the provenance, so really document all the steps. So these three categories correspond to the major topics of the training session today. So as part of the GeoSoft project, we want to teach about how to take care of your software, but the software really is always part of the bigger picture, which is the paper that you're publishing. And so this is why we have the geoscience paper of the future as a kind of bigger picture where software is a big component, but just a part of it. Okay, what we did as part of the OntoSoft project is to create a geoscience paper of the future pilot. So I mentioned earlier that we have an early career advisory committee. So we asked them, do you want to be trained in these best practices? The answer was yes, but it's much easier to make time if it's part of the work that you're doing. So what we did is do a pilot in the spring of this year where we asked them to spend 2 to 4 hours a week for 4 months. And at the end of the 4 months, they would receive all this training. And we would have a call every 2 weeks, and the call would be giving them training for something, some slice of what you are going to learn about today. And then they would have 2 weeks to work on it. And then at the following call, they would report and then, be taught about the next thing. And then they would go off and work on that. They could either pick a paper that they were writing at the time about new research that they were doing, and so they would incorporate these ideas into that paper, or they could take a paper that they had already published. Some of them actually looked back to their major paper from their thesis and wanted to document that more thoroughly, and so they are writing a geoscience paper of the future documenting a previously published result. So you can do both things. And this pilot was very successful. So we had 13 initial participants. They come from all areas of geosciences, from polar to volcanology to ecology, marine biology, all kinds of things, climate. So we really got a very broad perspective of the different kinds of research and how to document different kinds of research. So all of their papers will become examples of geoscience papers of the future as they are published in the special issue. I mentioned this special issue, so we started this initiative to actually go beyond these 13 GPF papers, and so have people like yourselves participating in the session today actually learning more about how to publish papers better. So we arranged for a special issue of Earth and Space Science, as I mentioned before, and you can submit a research article, which means that it's new research that you're reporting and it's written in the style of a Geoscience Paper of the Future, a GPF, or a technical report that actually documents some other article that you've published in the past that really describes the details of the science but doesn't describe so well how it was actually done. So you can see here the editors are people in hydrology, climate, and myself. The training topics that we cover really help you write these papers. So it's part of, not just doing a special issue or giving you the training, but they kind of both go hand in hand. We're doing a lot of these sessions all over the place. So if you have friends that you think could benefit from this, there's webinars, but also face-to-face meetings. So you just send us email and an RSVP like you all did today, and we'll be very happy to take more participants. So with that, that's a general introduction to GPF, and the first concrete part of the training, this was just background and motivation, will be given by Mimi, but I wanted to stop and ask if there's any questions that anybody has about this general motivation or the kinds of things that I talked about. I think a lot of these topics you all have heard about, maybe not as specifically or strikingly, but I think they're kind of in the air if you open the pages of Nature or Science or your favorite science magazine, sometimes the newspapers. So no questions?
Yolanda, I've got a question.
Yes. Who is this? Can you introduce yourself?
Claudia.
Claudia, yes.
Can you write a GPF even if your data is not open?
Yes, because there's many, and in fact we run into these problems, these issues in some of those initial GPF papers. So your data may not be open for many reasons. Maybe it's data that is coming from colleagues that have not published their paper yet, and so they give you permission to use the data but not to publish it further. And so what you need to do in a GPF is actually document the reasons or the ways in which your reader can get a hold of the data. So you can say, I cannot publish the data, but it has been generated from this project, funded from this agency, and this is the PI or the person to contact or the department to contact if you want this data. Sometimes the data you cannot make available for other reasons. So for example, some people get their data from NASA repositories and the data are extremely large. So you, as an author, you don't make the data available. You're simply telling the reader how they can get a hold of the same data in the same way that you got a hold of it. So you're not making the data available yourself. You're just telling the reader how to get a hold of the data. So that's about the data, but of course your paper will have other aspects, right? You'll have analyzed the data, or you'll have integrated different data sets, or you'll have made some hypotheses or conclusions that you obtain from the data. And so those are the steps that you should be mindful and be able to document.
Yes, so I just wanted to mention that based on my experience, sometimes I was writing a paper, and at a certain point, the server that was hosting the data became redundant, and the data just disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
And then, in those cases,
was it a server from a project?
Was a server from a research institute that didn't have funding to keep the server going. So they decided to switch it off because they thought nobody was using this data.
So that's a very, very sad situation. I don't think it's very frequent. So what we try to emphasize is your personal ability to try to make the data available. In those kinds of situations, you know, that project or that institute should have a provision for you to then look for the data that you used and try to make it available otherwise, at least the slice of the data that you used. But in general, I should tell you that there's tremendous concern for that kind of situation and the loss of data in science, the maintenance of repositories. So there's a lot of debate about who should pay for the maintenance of data. Maybe universities should contribute, maybe the public, maybe the government, maybe private foundations. So the debate is very much open, but there's a lot of repositories that are committing to giving you a permanent storage for data.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so let's go to the next topic, and that's Mimi. And I think you have the slides, Mimi, so I'd rather you drive the presentation, if that's okay.
Okay, that works. You have to switch presentation over to me, so there it is. Okay.
You should have it now.
Okay, so here's, you guys can see my screen, right?
Yep, we can see it.
Here we go. So there's basically, the other 5 parts are about the different aspects of the GPF. This first part here is making the data accessible and talking about documentation and sharing of the data. Okay, so up until this point, what we have been doing so far as scientists is that the most important thing is that you're trying to publish a peer-reviewed paper in a publication like in the journal. And so what happens is you have all these papers, then the data that goes into these papers are not being recorded or maintained in any special way, and they tend to get lost over time as the scientists who did the studies, they retire, they move on to other places. They might have all of their, like for older scientists, they might have them all on floppy disks or something, and then it just kind of disappears, and all you have left is the paper. And that's not really a good way to ensure reproducibility at future points. We are getting better at this. Now, instead of having all of these data being lost, there's been a lot of a push by both funders and by journals to get these data published so that they can be referred to by other people who want to build on the work. You put them in a repository and you have citations so that you can refer to it. And then some journals actually take data papers where you're describing a data set and not so much the science that's being done with data. Making data accessible, best practice. Okay, so what we're going to do next is that there are 5 parts to this. We're going to be talking a little bit about how you could publish it in a repository to make it accessible. We're going to talk about documentation. That's the general and domain metadata. That's number 2. And number 3, accessibility of the data. 4, you want to talk about how you set up a unique persistent identifier. In most cases, this is a DOI. I'll go over that in a bit. And then citation preference, what kind of formatting you want, what kind of information you want to put into the citation so that when somebody wants to refer to the data set later, how will they do that when they put it into their reference section. Okay, so the overall goals that we're trying to do here, we're first going to learn what the best practices are, and then we're going to go into how to implement these best practices. Okay, so starting with publication in a repository. There are a lot of data repositories out there. A lot of them are national scale. There are a lot of discipline-specific ones. For example, in oceanography, we tend to put a lot of our stuff in NOAA's NODC, for the National Oceanographic Data Archive. There's also places like BCODEMO and CCHDO with scripts for a lot of CTD data. There's also, I know NASA has a lot of their data. We get a lot of satellite data off of them. There are really generalized places like Figshare or Zenodo, which is basically you can pretty much upload anything that you produce. You can, if you have a data set, if you have a figure, or a table, or a model, if it's small, they actually have size limits, and they don't do any curation, which means that they just let you do whatever you want, put it up there, and they don't pay any attention to the quality or how well documented it is or anything like that. But they do give you a DOI, which we'll go into. Then on the other side, you have the curated data repositories, which is where you submit it to a group of people who will actually look it over and make sure that there are certain quality standards that you're filling. For example, NOAA and ODC, it's actually called NCEI now. You submit it to them, and then they will actually look it over and make their own versions and write metadata for you if you don't have metadata to the standards that they want. And then they will publish it, and it will be, you don't have as full control over what happens to your data as you would if you just use for Figshare or Zenodo. So that's kind of the trade-off if you want it to be all of a certain format that all looks the same for the repository, or if you just want to be able to put it somewhere and then share it yourself. And there are directories of data repositories out there. Here's a list of some examples, which is basically they just list the types of data repositories that you can go to and look for specific types of data. I think some of them are probably discipline specific also. Okay, so metadata is actually my specialty, so I'm probably going to go over this part in a little bit more detail. Metadata is basically about documenting the data. So you have a data set. It could be, for example, an Excel spreadsheet, which is pretty popular for where I work at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. And in the spreadsheet, you don't have a whole lot of information other than the actual data numbers. So the metadata is about what is this data set about. It could be, you want to start by saying, you give it a title to say what kind of study it came out of, where was the data collected, when was it collected, what time frame. If it's like field data, for example, is what I spend most of my time on. So you want to know, what part of the geographical part of the world did this data come from, in what time frame was it collected. You want a description, you want the description of the data set itself, which is, this data set contains these variables like temperature, salinity, chlorophyll or whatever, that were collected in Mobile Bay between October 1998 and December 1999 or something like that. But the other description would be the abstract, which is the purpose of the data. So these data were collected for a study that was going after the fisheries of something. We're collecting this data as part of another bigger project to study shrimp or something like that. Then the other really important part is the contact information for the PIs or whoever is holding the data set, so that in a lot of cases now, you actually have data sets out there where the PIs don't actually want it to be fully public. And so in order to get a hold of it, you have to contact them. And so the metadata needs to have contact information. It has to have an email address or a phone number so that you can contact the person who's holding the data and who can give permission to give it to you and let you use it. Then on the other side, we have domain specific. That's like discipline specific. You want keywords so that whoever's looking for data in an archive, if they're searching through your repository to find salinity data for the Gulf of Mexico, for example, they would type in salinity. You would want to include those kinds of tags in your data set, the metadata for your data set, so that they can find it. And then I've added data set characteristics should be explained in detail. And what I mean by that is that when you have all of this general information about, where was this data collected, who collected it, how did you collect it, you also need to be able to explain the actual data set. So you have an Excel spreadsheet, and it has individual columns of, different types of numbers in it. You might have the date and time it was collected, the location, the latitude, the longitude, temperature, salinity. All of those things need to be explained. Like, for example, if you have a date and time, you want the time to be, what time zone was it collected in? Did you take into account daylight savings? Latitude, longitude, is it in decimal degrees or is it in degree, minutes, seconds? Temperature, is it in Celsius or Fahrenheit? All of the individual columns have to be explained with their units. And in some cases, you need to explain the calculations that you use to arrive at the numbers in those columns. The methodology that was used, like, for example, if you're collecting, how did you collect the data? Did you collect the depth data with a yardstick that you just dropped into the mud? Or did you use a CTD? When you were looking at turbidity of the water, were you using a Secchi disk, or were you using something that was more electronic? and all of that kind of information needs to go in there so that when somebody needs to use that data later, they will be able to look back on it and get some context for how they can use the data, what kind of quality they can expect. Let's see. And then one of the things that a lot of people overlook is license. In academia, we mostly don't think a whole lot about copyright for intellectual property because we are getting publicly funded, and this data needs to be available publicly eventually. But the license just tells people how the data can be used. Can it be used commercially, for example? Can somebody take the data and do something that will allow them to make a profit off of this data? I think in a lot of cases we use either just public domain, which is CC0 for the Creative Commons, or we use, actually that's the next slide. Let me keep going. Okay, choosing a license. Creative Commons is probably the most common thing to do. Instead of having just full copyright, you can have something called a Creative Commons license, and you have different selections for what kinds of things you allow other people to do. CC0 means basically public domain. Anyone can do anything they want with your work. CC BY would be attribution, which means that you have to, if somebody wants to use the data, they have to credit you with the work. They have to, and it might not just be you personally. It could be you as a PI, the graduate student that actually did the work, the funding agency that funded the work, the name of the project that the work was a part of, things like that. Okay, now we're going to domain-specific metadata standards. There are a lot of different kinds out there. The one here at the bottom that says WaterML is popular with the hydrologists. ISO 19115 is popular for geospatial data. Anything that was collected in the field would fit under ISO 19115 because they keep track of latitude, longitude information. And the idea is that eventually you can plot it onto a map. Anything that can be plotted onto a map. I think this one is EML, which is for ecologists have their own called ecological metadata language. And in a lot of cases, these individual languages, especially this one is Morpho, you can actually go to a website and people will have made online tools that you can use to write your metadata in a really easy to follow series of, fill in the blank boxes, and you don't even have to look at the actual coding behind metadata. So, for example, I know ISO 19915 is a huge amount of code behind what it actually looks like. And WaterML and EML are both XML languages, so there's a lot of code behind them. And a lot of people don't really want to know about that, so they just go to these portals and find a way to just do a whole lot of fill in the blank, and it'll fill it all in for you. Okay, then we go to accessibility of data, manual and machine. Manual accessibility, mostly, as I understand it anyway, it's about human readability of the data. So you go to a repository, you do your search, you get a list of results of data sets that fit what you're looking for. And then you can just read through the titles, the abstract, the keywords to see which ones you want, and you can download it. Machine accessibility means that the metadata is set up in such a way that a computer app can be written to read the metadata and do more sophisticated things with it. This is Quasi, which does stuff with, basically it's a hydrology thing. I'm not a hydrologist, I'm not real clear what exactly it does, but that's an example of machine accessibility. Okay, best practices, unique persistent identifier. Now there's 3 different kinds. Uniform resource locator, or URL, is basically the same thing. If you've ever gone to a web browser and looked at the address, that's a URL there. That's uniform resource locator, and that's the address of whatever the website you're looking at is. A persistent URL is exactly like that, except you go through an organization that keeps track of where, basically it's a website that does pointers. So you have an assigned persistent URL that's permanent, and you can tell the site, the organization, where that URL should actually point. So, and I'm actually getting way ahead of myself. But yeah, okay, and then digital object identifier, DOI, I'll go over that in a minute too. So URLs are really pretty easy to create. Pretty much anyone who's setting up a website can just create one, and it'll point to whatever you're looking at. A Perl has the advantage over the URL because it can be set up to point to something that moves. So for example, you are in grad school, you get a bunch of data set together to do your thesis or your dissertation, and then you graduate, and your university is not going to leave you some space to keep all of your research products, so you have to take it with you. So then you become a postdoc, move to another institution, you put your stuff there so that it can still be accessible. Then you get a different postdoc somewhere else, and then you get a job as a professor somewhere. What the Perl does is that you can just go to their site and say, where exactly are you now? And just point to the actual current location. And as long as you keep that updated, you don't have to update everyone. You don't have to tell everyone where the new web address is. They'll just keep going to the Perl address and they'll be able to find your data. And then a DOI, I guess people who have, if you've been publishing papers for a while, you have probably seen these. It's a number that's at the top of your article. On any digital article is going to probably have one. A lot of them, actually I know some of them don't yet, but a lot of them do now. And it's basically like a Perl. You can click on it and it will always go to the article that you're looking for. And it's not just for articles, it can also be for data sets. Okay, and then we go into citation preference. The data citation format, this is the sort of a recommendation for the kinds of information you would want to put into a citation. You would want the authors of the data set, the year that it was published, some kind of descriptive name, a title, the name of the repository that it's in, an identifier such as a DOI, and the date and time that you last looked for it at the location of the identifier. Because, as a lot of things go with online stuff, as things go along, people update things and the DOI might still be the same, but the actual data might have changed in the meantime. So having a date and time is important so that people know, what it looked like at that point in time. Okay, what is slide? I think there's supposed to be more stuff loaded onto this slide. Okay, that's weird. Am I the only one seeing a complete blank here?
Nope, I see it too. Is it animated? Do you think it's?
No, it's a bunch of text.
Yeah, no, it's not animated, so I don't know.
Just present it this way. We can see the text here.
Yeah, let me just make it a small screen.
Yeah.
Okay, what if? And here are some questions for what kinds of complications you can run into when you are starting to document your data set and figuring out how you want to set up the DOIs. For example, if your data set is composed of a large number of files, do you want to do a DOI for each individual file, or do you want to do it for the whole set as one big zip file, as one big package? And that kind of consideration really depends on what the data set looks like, what it's about, what kinds of things other people might want to do with it. If they are likely to only need like one specific file out of the whole thing, then you might consider making a DOI for each one separately. If the entire package makes sense as a single unit, then you might just want to put a DOI for the whole thing. Other considerations, if it's from a public repository, it's not actually your data, but you still want to be able to refer to it. You can write down the query that you use to search for in the public repository to get the data, and then just write that down and then put a DOI for that. Or if you have a subset of data from a larger source, you can say, here's the subset that I used, and I can put a DOI on it. I know that there are sometimes people will take the same really broad, they'll have a database full of data from some kind of long-term monitoring thing, and they want to write several papers out of it, and some of the data that they're using is going to overlap between paper number 1 and paper number 2. And so what you could do is that each paper will need its own version of the data, because the paper the publication that it's going into requires the data that's specific to that paper to be published. So you'll have individual versions. They might overlap a bit, but each one would still need a separate DOI just to keep it separate from each other. And anytime you want to use data that's not yours, the first thing you should do is make sure you have permission to use the data. Either just ask them permission, or if it's from a public repository, you want to make sure that you read the copyright notices for how the data can be used. And in a lot of cases, there will be some kind of statement of use constraints, like what do you need to do in order to be allowed to use this data? Do you need to be from an academic institution? Do you need to credit certain funding or PI names or things like that? When you're writing metadata for your own data set, and you're using one of the standards like ISO 19915 or EML or Dublin Core, there's usually a place called use constraints somewhere in there, and that's where you would put down things like licensing information for your data set. Okay, so that's kind of a broad, very quick overview of what the 5 best practices are. And now we're going to go into how you can apply all of this information when you're trying to write your own or get your own data sets up to being available for sharing. Okay, so the simple approach, if you're just making it accessible, you just go find a repository like Figshare where you don't have to do a whole lot of work. You create an account, and then you upload the data. Maybe you write it a short description, give it a good title, and specify some kind of license, Creative Commons. And then there you go, it's right there. You can then just point to it as you need to. Being a little bit more thorough about this, if you want to find it works better to have a repository that's actually specific to the community that is likely to use your data. So if you have discipline-specific places, like oceanography has its specific sets of places that you can go to look for oceanography data. So you would want to try to put your data in there. And then you want to make sure you have thorough metadata that's as detailed as possible. And the thing about metadata really is that when you first start writing them, I mean, it does take a lot of time to make sure you get all of the details correct and in order, and it does take a lot of time to do it that way. But really, you're trying to make your data useful to other people, far out into the future, you really want to do it right and do it as good of a job of it as you can at the beginning. Because otherwise, if you're just doing a really simple, quick job, your data will be useful up until your contact information is no longer around because you've retired or you've passed on. And then suddenly, nobody has anywhere to go to ask questions about your data, if they have any. And if you didn't write any of it down, then your data stops being very useful. So I'm a really big stickler on metadata just for that reason, just because I want to see people who are going to put in the time anyway, excuse me, to try to do a good job of it in the first place, because if you do it right in the first place, you save yourself a lot of time later when you have to revise it or add things to it or update it. And also a lot of questions from other people trying to use your data. We're going to, if you wrote it all down in the first place, they don't have to come and try to find you to ask you any questions. Okay, and then once you've got your data in a repository, you want to cite it in the papers that you're writing about your data. And usually you would cite it in pretty much the same way as you would cite any other peer-reviewed publication in a journal somewhere. We went over the kinds of information you would want to put in the citation in your reference section. So you would do that, and then you would just do the same thing where, if it's your data, my name is Den, so it'd be like Den 2015, put it in parentheses in your text, and then you refer to it pretty much the same way. You could also put it in the special data resources section or put it in the acknowledgement section. And it's really up to what the journal, a lot of the individual journals will probably be better to ask about exactly how you would do it. Okay, and I guess that's pretty much all I've got. Do we have any questions about data sharing? Put everybody to sleep?
Hi, Mimi. This is Claudia.
Yeah,
Sorry,
go ahead.
I have got a question. How do you know that your data was your metadata was populated properly? I mean, do you have standards to follow? Do you look at other papers, how they, what metadata they used? I mean,
Okay, so when you're looking at domain-specific metadata standards, I refer to ISO 19115 because that's the one I'm most familiar with, and there are other ones for different, like WaterML for hydrology, Morpho or EML for ecologists. Each of these will give you extremely specific formatting guidelines for how the metadata should be formatted. So for example, I can actually show you an ISO one offhand. Like if you look at this one, for example, this one that I've been working on, this is an ISO 19115, and it's got a lot of XML code in it, but and then you have to fill in specific information within the code in a specific order. And the thing that you have with something like Morpho or EML, like this one here, what it will do is it will give you an interface where you can just fill in the information that you are looking for without looking at any of that code. And then you press a button at the end, and it will spit out an XML file for you that has it all in the right places, in the right order. And there are website tools available that will do all of that for you.
okay, that's useful. Thank you.
Any other ones?
If your data doesn't necessarily fit into these domain-specific metadata standards, is there a generalized standard available?
I think Dublin Core is supposed to be pretty general. I don't know if it's written down anywhere. Dublin Core is a really popular one that I've seen around. ISO 19115 will pretty much cover anything earth science related that was. You can actually probably put lab results into ISO 19115. You would just have to not. You would have to get kind of creative with the latitude, longitude fields, which are required. There are other ones like FCDC put out something called CSVGM that was in use from the U.S. government. All of the federal agencies here was using that one before they started transitioning to ISO, and it will take basically pretty much anything science, really. I mean, a large number of scientific disciplines gets covered in, and you can. I mean, sometimes you have to be creative about which fields you use and which fields you ignore. Some of them have mandatory things like you're required to put in a title, an abstract, and a purpose, but you're not required to put in like a lot of geospatial details if you don't have any of that kind of information.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think there's general metadata in the Dublin Core, as we said, who's the author, what data was posted, things like that. And I think more and more science tools and instruments, they generate metadata for you. So I think things are getting more and more automated and more facilitating the addition of metadata. Okay, any other questions? That's it? All right. Okay, so we'll move to the third part of this first half of the training before the break. So we'll cover publishing your software, sharing your software. Okay, do I have the screen, Erin? Am I sharing my screen?
Hang on. No, not yet. Okay. Now you should see the presenter bar.
It's here. Perfect. Okay, so let's talk about making your software accessible. So what I'm going to cover is, you have a piece of software, you want to make it available to others. I remember meeting a climate researcher who was saying, I need to use this climate model. It's a very old model. It uses a very old format, and I'm writing all this code to convert the data to that format. Many people have done this before, and I'm not a good programmer, and it's taking me months to do this, right? So she was wishing that someone else would have been gracious enough to share their software, even though it seemed kind of not very glorified, not very important, that it was just doing data conversion. So once she wrote the software, I encouraged her to publish it and to share it. So she wondered, is it ready? Is there something that I can do to make it better for others or more usable for others? So these are the kinds of things that we want to talk about. So how you make your software ready for publication, what are kind of high-level things that you can do. Then we'll talk about best practices for software publication, and then as Mimi did, we'll cover how to implement those best practices. So making your software ready for publication, I'll cover 7 topics. So that's things that you have to be mindful of. None of this is required, so if you just don't have the time or the inclination and you prefer to release your software as is, then that's fine. So let me cover these topics in turn. So one is considering whether to publish the source code or the executable. So if you publish your source code, that makes your research more transparent. There's a lot of software repositories where if you publish your code, you can have help with version control. Also, you can have other people report bugs to you or even help you fix the bugs in your code because they can see the code and so on. If you publish the executable, it's harder for you to maintain because you may have to build it for various systems, but it's also faster for other people to use. So it's good to publish the source code, but if not, at least consider publishing the executable. And what's very important is that you document any runtime dependencies. So if your software will only run with a prior version of MATLAB, then you should document that. So if you share your source code, there's a lot of source code repositories where we suggest that you may want to publish it, but you could also publish it on your own website. It doesn't matter how you do it, but as long as you really do it. If you publish your executable, then there's various sophisticated tools to keep track of exactly how you build your executables, and that facilitates the sharing of executables. But you don't have to do that either if you choose not to. It takes time sometimes. So to create your executable from the source, for others to create an executable from the source, you should give them detailed instructions, anything that they need to set up your software, but also you could use build automation software like Maven, for example, to compile the code. So there's tools that help you make the generation of the executable a lot less painful. So if you're interested in any of these topics that I'm mentioning, you should learn more about these tools. We're just letting you know that they exist. The other thing is that we are asked a lot is, are they going to have trouble running my software if they have a different machine? So what we talk about is that you should document and list all the dependencies. So any libraries, if you use a third-party library that you added to your R software, you should mention that. And also you should have no hard-coded machine-specific details. So you should have no hard-coded paths or server names. So if you have anything like, for example, the location of a file that your program assumes, you should put it in a configuration file, for example, or make it a parameter of the software. The third thing that we want you to know is that it's important and interesting to make your software modular. So some people won't use your entire piece of code. They might want to reuse pieces. So that's always useful to let people pick and choose the building blocks of your code. So if you are able to factor it out into smaller modules, that's always useful for other people. And you can see on the right a workflow where we've created it with a system that actually takes pieces of code and kind of composes it as building blocks into an overall workflow, just to illustrate this notion. The fourth thing is you may want to consider making your software configurable. So a lot of times we see that people put parameters or some configurations in the software itself as a constant in the code. And so you actually have to go into the files, the software files, and actually change the values if you want to change that. So we suggest that you consider putting those in a separate configuration file. Another important and very useful thing for others is if you make your software report errors gratefully. So since you've run your software with a lot of different kinds of data, you may know that if the data goes beyond midnight into the next day, then that causes some problems. So it's useful that you document code failures. So if something goes wrong, maybe you report a nice message so that they know what went wrong. So if you want to do something to prepare your software, this is a useful thing to do for others. And then finally, this may be the easiest thing to do, which is to provide test data. So if they're going to install and run your software, at least give them test data and a reference of what the expected results are so that they know when they're running it correctly. And then finally, there's actually code analyzers. This is software that will profile your code, tell you entire routines that you may not be using anymore, places where things are more inefficient. So those are available out there. Just search for a code analyzer for the particular language or tools that you're using. And then finally, there's people that actually do code review sessions. So you may get 2 or 3 of your colleagues, you review each other's codes, and it's a way to, as you review their code, you may have questions about how they did a specific thing. So set up a code review session with colleagues if you really want to get good feedback and reciprocate to them about their code. So that's the 7 things I wanted to cover on just thinking about how to get your software in good shape before you share it. Some of these things take effort, and so if you don't have the time, you don't have to do these things, but just so you know that those are things that you can do to improve your software. What's really more important is how you improve your best practices for sharing software. So we'll cover 3 things. One is putting it in a public accessible location, the license, and the citation. Very much the same kinds of things that Mimi covered for data. So in terms of a public location, there's a few options. So publishing your software in a code repository like GitHub, for example, or the Apache Software Foundation, it's a pretty sophisticated way to publish software. It's fantastic. So if you have the time, you can learn to use GitHub. You can see how other people report bugs or follow if you publish new versions of your software. GitHub also and other repositories will give you a DOI for your software so that you can cite it. So that's very useful. If your software is pretty involved, you may want to make it into an Apache project. So Apache is different from GitHub in that there's actually a community that will help you oversee the contributors to your software. It will make sure that there's diversity, that your software is sustainable. It takes more work, but you have a lot of support in terms of keeping your software usable. Those are the more advanced, longer-term things. In the short term, if you have a piece of software that you want to publish, it's very easy to make it available. One way is to just put it on your website. Remember to use a permanent URL, a persistent URL, as Mimi described for the data. Do the same thing. And give a permanent URL to every version of the software that you write a paper with or that you release. So any significant version, you should give it a permanent URL and just use that to cite the software in your papers. If you want, you could also put your software in a data repository. So you could post it in Figshare or Zenodo. So Mimi described these repositories for data, and actually a lot of people will post their software there and treat the code like data. And these repositories are well aware of this, and they're trying to extend what they do to support the software, the publication of software, tracking different versions, and so on and so forth. And they'll also, as you know, from Mimi's presentation, they give you a DOI for your software. So these are different levels of, I guess, involvement and support that you can do to publish your software. Any one of those options is okay, depending on your time and how important the software is to you and how many users you anticipate that you'll have, and so on and so forth. But you can see that in all these cases, you'll have a PERL or a DOI that you can use to refer to the software, and the software will be publicly available. The second thing is, I wanted to mention that if you have a code repository like GitHub, for example, this is the picture of one of our GPF authors' GitHub page. So you can see that there's a version control mechanism, when the commits have been made, the branches that you make if you decide to branch out different versions of the code. And then you can also see that the contributors, the community, can download your code, and if they find a problem, they'll post what's called a pull request so that you can actually send to whatever author out there in GitHub comments on their code and ways to improve it. And if you fix some bug, you can also send it to them very easily. So longer term, you may want to invest in teaching yourself about GitHub. There's a lot of great materials and videos and tutorials on this longer term if you want to invest in this. Okay. I mentioned the case of the Apache Software Foundation. They really oversee the projects. They take your software, they'll form an incubator, they'll try to make sure that you have a diverse community, and then when the incubator has been going on for a little bit of time, they'll form what they call a project, and they'll give you a lot of support along the way. So if your software is significant, this may be a very good option rather than GitHub, where you basically have to sustain the software and the community on your own. The second thing I mentioned, so publishing in a public repository, the second thing I mentioned is using an open source license. So Mimi mentioned the Creative Commons licenses for data. For software, the licenses are a little bit different. So in general, people will use open source software licenses that are published by the Open Source Initiative. They're kind of recognized as widely accepted licenses that support open source sharing. And there's many different variations, many different kinds of licenses, depending on what you want to restrict other users to do. So an open source license that's a little bit restrictive is the new GPL license. We always recommend to use a more permissive license. So unless you have reasons to constrain how other people use your software, just consider using an Apache 2 or an MIT license, because it will let others do anything they want to modify your software as long as they credit you and they mention that they got the software from you, and they keep the software open so that if they make the software better, you can actually see what they've done with it. So just choose a license from these choices from the opensource.org site. And then finally, the citation. So you should be using a permanent unique identifier, so either a persistent URL or a DOI, just like for data. And then the repositories sometimes give you the ability to assign these DOIs or maybe other kinds of permanent URLs. And so the software citation takes a very similar format that you saw with the data, the authors, the date of publication, time of retrieval, all of these things. The repository, but also there will be a note about the version of the software that you used, and these turns out to be very important. So now that we talked about the best practices, how do you make them happen? How do you implement them? So the simplest way that you can do is to just create a public entry for your software. So a public entry could be something on your lab website, something on your personal website. and then you should assign it a persistent URL so that as you move through your life, that URL does not change. Or as your university or your institution changes the way that they assign URLs, you'll always have control to make that persistent URL resolve to whatever current page you want people to go to. Or just upload your software to Figshare and let them give you a DOI. So this takes minutes. There's no reason, or seconds actually. So there's no reason not to publish your software because you think that it's going to take a long time or anything like that. And then specify the metadata. The most important piece is, you are the author, but also what license you want to release the software under, and make sure that you specify how you want people to cite your software. Ideally, if you write a lot of software, or if you write software that has a lot of users, we would encourage you to learn to use a code repository. It will have version tracking. It will support you to do collaborative software development. So just make sure that you do that. This code repositories often give you a unique identifier. Make sure that you choose a license, and also mention in the front page how you would want that software to be cited. In terms of how to cite the software in your paper, is very analogous to the way that you cite data. So you'll put the citation in the references section, and then you might, as you write the text in the paper, just mention it in the text. So to say, the first step is to reformat the data to blah, and we use the software, and then you put the citation there. Or you could have a special data resources section or a special software resources section. Some people like to treat software like data and so on. Others would prefer a separate software resources section. Or you could have the citation come up in the acknowledgments section. So sometimes you say, I'd like to recognize that I've used data from these repositories. Here's the citations, and the same thing for the software. So you have all of these different mechanisms to cite the software. As Mimi mentioned, some of the journals have special guidelines on how to cite data or software. And that's it. So let me stop here and ask if anybody has questions about this portion, and then we'll take a break and continue in about 30 minutes. So, any questions about this?
Hi, I have got a question. This is Claudia.
Okay.
Have you got any specific recommendation regarding how to document your code, in terms of how to document your input and output format or your functions, something like using Doxygen for C code or something like that? Do you have any specific recommendation?
So there's a lot of tools out there. I think there's a lot of possible ways, but I think that's the topic of our next section. So how to document software.
Okay.
Stock it there. And I know that there's some tools that help you depending on the language that you use and the way that you use your code. There's different tools to do this. So we'll talk about this a little bit more.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions about the software sharing part? Anything that we've talked about so far? Okay, so time to stretch your legs. If you have questions, we can always address them after we come back. Time to stretch your legs, maybe get a snack or some food. I know I will get some. And we'll see you in about half an hour at the top of the hour, okay? Thank you.
Thanks, Yolanda.
Thanks. Erin, should we log out or should we just pause or mute ourselves?
I think just pause and mute.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks.